Today, we are diving into the epic, centuries-long story of how Indonesia went from a collection of powerful kingdoms to the single, independent nation we know today. It's an incredible story of unbelievable wealth, brutal colonization, and a spirit of resistance that just wouldn't quit. So let's get right into it.
So you gotta ask yourself, what was it about this massive chain of islands that made it the absolute #1 prize on the planet? Why were empires willing to pour fortunes and countless lives into controlling this place? Well, the short answer is spices. But the real story? Well, that's a potent mix of greed, ambition, and a little bit of faith.
You see, this entire saga really kicks off with a global obsession for things we just toss in our food today without a second thought. We're talking about cloves, nutmeg, stuff that back then was literally worth more than its weight in gold.
And to really get the mindset of that era, you have to remember these three words: gold, glory, and gospel. Gold is pretty obvious: the hunt for riches, spices, anything valuable. Glory was all about power, prestige, making your empire the biggest on the map. And gospel was the drive to spread Christianity. That powerful combo is what fueled the entire age of discovery.
And boy, did it create a mad dash. I mean, look at this timeline. The Portuguese were first on the scene in 1511. Then the Spanish show up a decade later and immediately start playing local kingdoms off each other. But the real game changer? That was the Dutch, landing in 1596, with the English right on their heels. The competition was absolutely fierce, and the islands quickly became the main stage for a huge European showdown.
At first, the goal was just a trade. Business. But as things got more and more competitive, the mission changed. It wasn't enough to just trade for spices anymore. You had to control the source. And this is where the story takes a really dark turn, especially when it comes to the Dutch.
350 years. Just let that number sink in for a moment. That's how long the Dutch presence would dominate the archipelago, transforming from simple traders into full-blown colonial masters. It's a period of time that would forever shape the nation.
So, how did one small country manage this? Their secret weapon was the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. Look, this was not your average company. Founded in 1602, the Dutch government basically gave it the power to act like its own country. It truly was a state within a state.
And the power they had was just staggering. Think about it. This company could print its own money. It had its own private army and navy. They enforced a brutal monopoly. And if you were a local who dared to sell spices to anyone else, well, the punishment was swift and harsh. They were the law.
And even after the VOC eventually went bankrupt, the Dutch government just took over directly, and things got even more exploitative. Just look at the cultuurstelsel, or the forced cultivation system. This policy forced farmers to use a fifth of their land not for food to feed their families, but to grow cash crops like coffee and sugar for the Dutch. And get this, if the harvest failed, the farmers took the hit. It was a system designed for pure extraction, causing immense suffering.
Now, of course, the people of the archipelago didn't just sit back and take this. No way. For centuries, resistance was constantly flaring up, but these early fights, as heroic as they were, all ran into the same fundamental problem.
And this resistance was fierce. In Java, Prince Diponegoro led a massive 5-year guerrilla war that was incredibly costly for the Dutch. Over in Sumatra, you had the Padri War, which started as a local dispute, but when the Dutch got involved, it turned into a full-blown war against the colonizers. These were huge, bloody conflicts.
But here's the crucial takeaway. Despite all the bravery, all the sacrifice, these wars failed to kick the Dutch out. And why? Because the resistance was regional. People were fighting for Java or for Sumatra. They weren't yet fighting for Indonesia. This allowed the Dutch to isolate each rebellion, focus their military might, and crush them one by one. The idea of a single united nation just wasn't there yet.
This string of failures led to a huge shift in thinking. It became clear that freedom couldn't be won with spears and cannons alone, especially when everyone was fighting separately. A totally new kind of struggle was needed, one that was fought with ideas, with organizations, and with a shared sense of being one people.
So that's the big question, right? How do you possibly unite thousands of islands, hundreds of different cultures and languages, into a single movement? What could create a common identity from all that incredible diversity?
Well, a few things started to click into place. For one, centuries of shared suffering gave everyone a common enemy. And ironically, a Dutch policy that aimed to civilize locals through education actually created a brand new class of Indonesian thinkers.
They were inspired by what was happening in other countries, and they started forming modern organizations, like Budiutomo, to push for change.
And then came the turning point. In 1928, young leaders from all over the archipelago came together for what was called the Sumpah Pemuda, the Youth Pledge, and they declared something absolutely radical for the time, that they had one homeland, one nation, and one language, Indonesia. For the first time, the idea of Indonesia was officially born.
So this powerful new national spirit had been building for decades, and it finally got its chance during the absolute chaos of World War II. The Japanese had invaded and shattered the myth that European powers were invincible, and as the war came to a close, a very sudden, very narrow window of opportunity swung open.
Just look at how fast everything moved in August 1945. The bombs fall, and on August 15th, Japan surrenders. This created a total power vacuum. The Japanese were defeated, but the Allies hadn't arrived yet to take over. Indonesian leaders knew this was it. This was their shot. The next 48 hours would literally decide the nation's fate.
But even at this critical moment, there was a huge disagreement. The older, established leaders, like Sukarno and Hatta, the old guard, they wanted to be cautious to avoid a bloodbath. But the youth guard, these young, fiery revolutionaries, were having none of it. They insisted that independence had to be seized now, by their own power, not accepted as some kind of handout. The tension got so high, they actually kidnapped the older leaders to force their hand.
Somehow, they reached a compromise. In this frantic all-night session, the leaders drafted the Proclamation of Independence. And after intense debate, the simple, powerful text was ready. The next morning, Friday, August 17, 1945, at 10 o'clock, Sukarno stepped in front of a small crowd at his home and read the words that announced to the world that a new nation was born.
Of course, that proclamation was really just the beginning. The Dutch would come back, and a brutal 4-year war still had to be fought. But that declaration set an unstoppable force in motion. And it leaves us with one final thought. After a 350-year fight to win freedom, the struggle to define, build, and maintain that freedom as one nation, well, that's a fight that continues every single day.